Well, the college football season rolls on. I'm Brady Michael, and I will once again be hogging the mic. And I forgot to say it last episode, but coming to you from a cloudy and just desolate Jonesboro, Arkansas today. Much like Fayetteville kind of felt, Arkansas coming off of a 28-6 win against Kent State. We'll have the good, the bad, and of course the ugly from that game. Plus a look ahead to week 3. You have the BYU Cougars come to town, and a lot of doubts surrounding the SEC right now. Is the SEC in trouble? We'll dive into that a little bit there. And then the week 3 slate of college football games is not ideal. Nonetheless, we'll look at some of the highlight games and some lines that I shouldn't be relaying to you. So if you don't want to take my advice, because I wouldn't want to take my own advice, then it may be best to close your ears towards the back half of this show. But before we go anywhere, Hawgin the Mic can be heard on Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Google Podcasts. And if you're listening/watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe and share the podcast with your fellow Razorback fans. Or if they just like the SEC, I try to keep plenty of SEC flavor in here as well. You can follow me personally on Instagram at Brady_Michael. Michael spelled Michael. Replace the I with a 1. And over on Twitter/X at bmichael with Michael the same way. And if you're so inclined to go over and read my articles over on fifthquarter.net, all you have to do is search /author/I'm Just Brady, and there it'll be. My most recent article was on Isaiah Auguste of having a chance to break out against Kent State, and the man didn't even get a single carry. But I digress. Let's go ahead and look at that Kent State review. Not that there's a lot of good to be had, but you look at Kent State in week 1. They played on a Thursday night at UCF, the bounce house, and they gave up 700 plus yards to UCF. They ended up losing that game 56-6. John Rice Plumlee, who transferred in for Gus Malzahn last season from Ole Miss, he had over 370 offensive yards. And then on the flip side, Michael Alemo, Kent State's quarterback, ended up going 12 of 31 passing and had an interception. Kent State as a team averaged 2.6 yards per carry. The expectation was pretty much set with what Arkansas was going to have to do when they came to town, and that was just bulldoze them, roll them over. And when you look at the start that Arkansas had, I would say it was the equivalent of when you don't start the car to warm it up in freezing temperatures, because you'll get in the car, it's still going to be cold. You will go somewhere, but it's going to be a pretty miserable ride whenever you could be riding in a warm car. I don't know. You look at this game from a wide lens, and Arkansas wasn't the only SEC team to struggle against an inferior opponent. Kent State's ranked 133rd out of 133 FBS teams, I might add, but we'll talk about this here in a minute. But you look at Kentucky, they decided to wake up in the fourth quarter against Eastern Kentucky, I believe it was. Missouri had a dogfight with Middle Tennessee State, and then Austin Peay decided they wanted to show up and give Tennessee a run for their money in the first half. That's just a few off the top of my head, but this game against Kent was a roller coaster as far as the key moments went. You have Antonio Grier, who didn't play in game 1 in Little Rock. His first snap may have been the talking point of the game, but a pick 6 in that first quarter when the offense was not moving the ball. He was the only spark to get that game going. And then you had KJ Jefferson on offense. He was missing a lot of guys. Now, it's not going to reflect in his 13 of 19 passing, but he had Tesla be there to bail him out on a handful of circus catches. I say circus catches. It was more just contested guys all over him, non-pass interference calls, and he was just going down, scooping the ball, reliable as can be. Then you have that 4th and 1 handoff in our own territory to Dom, and they broke through that line, and Dom Johnson tried to bounce it out outside the left tackle, and it was at a snail's pace. I don't know what the idea was there, but Pittman decided to not go with his Samalytics, as he calls it, and went with what seemed like the best thing to do under Enos's thoughts. Maybe we'll see more Samalytics in the future. I hope we do, because that was not a situation that you needed to go for it in. You had that bad snap inside the 10 that ended up leading to a touchdown. You had KJ reach down with his left hand, palm the football, roll to his right, and then you have Andrew Armstrong just chilling at the back of the end zone. And then at the very end of the game, in the fourth quarter, that goal line stand from the 2-yard line, which ended up leading to Arkansas being able to kill the last 6 or so minutes of the clock on the ground. I believe it was 10 or 11 straight carries that just killed the clock. So before we discuss the good that came out of this game, I say hesitantly, let's go ahead and look at the stats that came out of this game. As said earlier, KJ Jefferson, 13 of 19 passing, just 136 pass yards and 2 touchdowns. He also had 48 on the ground. And side note, he apparently had the best QBR out of quarterbacks in week 2 at the FBS level. Now, see, I don't know how Pro Football Focus determined that, or what. But I mean, he didn't throw a pick, and I don't know. That's the only positive there. AJ Green, 15 carries for 82 yards. You also had Art Rashad Dominion. He had 10 carries for 34 yards. He also picked up the single rushing touchdown. And then Isaac Taslaw, 3 catches, 51 yards. And then Andrew Armstrong had 2 touchdown catches, 4 total with 21 yards only. You look at the defensive side of the ball. This is going to lead into the good side. Jaheim Thomas had 12 tackles, 1.5 sacks, and 2 TFLs. You also had Trajan Jeffcoat get co-SEC D Lineman of the Week. So it's a mouthful there. He had 3 tackles, 1.5 sacks, and 2 TFLs. He got active. And then speaking of getting active, in the second half, Chris Paul Jr. came out there. He got 5 tackles and 1 sack. The team as a whole had 7 sacks from 7 different players. Now, some picked up like a half a sack because, I mean, you heard those 2 mentioned had 1.5 sacks. So math kind of checks out there. But the good thing to come out of this game had to be Jaheim Thomas and the overall defensive line play. Now, after week 1, there was lots of questioning the defensive line. Side note, before I move on, is that Western Carolina actually beat Samford in week 2, 30-7, and allowed just 46 rush yards. And they had 546 yards of offense against a really good Samford team down there in the FCS level. Not that that means anything. So all the defense ended up doing to Kent State after the doubts were being thrown out there by the casual fans is they had just 26 rush yards when you factor in the Michael Alamo sack yardage. Now, they also picked up 11 TFLs and 7 sacks, as mentioned. Now, there were times when the defensive line did fail to get a push or a blocking scheme just ended up creating a little gap and beat them. But the defensive line went out there and did what was expected of them and honestly overachieved a little bit. They'll be able to tweak those little things. I think we've seen that issue in the past. Like you look at the Rice game in 21, it's just they struggled to get up for this game, but they still were just able to physically dominate. And that's what you saw on that side of the ball. Thomas was just all over the field when it came down to the run game and blitzes, especially. But there's an issue that they need to get fixed with Thomas because his pass recognition was exposed pretty heavily. You have running backs coming out of the backfield on delayed routes. Tight ends were doing short out routes and little slants, and he was just not picking up on it. And I don't know whether to place that reasoning on not being able to read the QB's eyes. Now, his placement on the field due to play calling or just lack of experience as a guy that's heavily been a pass rusher in his career. There's just no telling. If he's late to picking up a man like that in SEC play, it's going to bite Arkansas way worse than the few that he ended up giving up to Kent State. It's something that I did wind up hitting on in his player breakdown over on fifth quarter. He's natural when it comes down to playing his position everywhere but in coverage. And now maybe quarterback spies are an exception there because he's got the speed and the get off to make that recognition. So that's something to maybe keep an eye on. Now, the bad is that the running back ability seems to be taking a nosedive combined with the O-line's ability to not create any space. Now, for starters, I mentioned Dom Johnson a second ago. He does not look like himself, both physically with the ball in his hands, or, I mean, mentally when it comes down to just finding a gap. Now, we know he's slow. We knew that coming in to this season. He'd probably be running safe. He's still got the knee brace on. He's 250 pounds. All the boxes are checked there. But it was just hard to watch, mainly on that 4th and 1 stop where he went backwards 2 yards. He ended up finishing the game with 7 carries for 8 yards, and as mentioned at the start of the show, no sign of Isaiah Augustov. After proving, I might add, that he had chops in week 1. He was pushing the pile with his legs. I don't remember the stats off the top of my head, but it was like 4 carries for 20 yards or so. You just have to let his balance of power and speed maybe get after those Kent State guys, and they just chose to keep him out. Now, if that's like a future red shirt decision, this is one of those games you got to play him in, so maybe he had an injury. We can speculate all we want. Mainly happening during the first half, it seemed like it was cleaned up for the rest of the running backs during the second half, and I say, like, trying to find the gap, not bouncing it outside. You started seeing Rashad DeBinion and AJ Green get vertical more often rather than just bounce it outside at the first sign of a white jersey coming down a gap. So, I mean, that's what ended up leading to that long drive there in the fourth quarter to put the game on ice, so to speak. There was good enough push as well by the end of the game from the offensive line. All that kind of gelled together. But I would say that's mostly credited to how tired that Kent offensive line had to be by then. A lot of leaning on them. There were plenty of times where the line would just lock arms and not create a hole until that last drive. The tackles, and I'll be honest here, they haven't really done it for me, and I understand they're young. That was a big issue coming into this season. You look outside, Devon Manuel, he's been hurt, and so they've had to put Chambly in there. Patrick Kudus on the right side. I just think Crawford, being the bulldozer that he is, and Pittman wanting to establish the run more, I think he's got to be the guy that starts on that right side. And now, as Sam put it in the presser yesterday, I believe, they want to get more line displacement by any means necessary. And so I know that they've released the depth chart already, and I'm pretty sure Kudus is still listed as the starter, but I hope they give Crawford more reps at right tackle. I don't like him as a pass protector, but having extra help there with Bo Limmer and Joshua Braun, just the interior offensive lineman inside, I feel like maybe they can deal with his lack of foot speed on that outside. We'll see. The ugly in this game is that it took putting KJ Jefferson on the line just to start salting away this game and moving the football. Now, it was pretty glaringly obvious that Enos did not want KJ in a game of this magnitude to be putting his body on the line, which I respect that. But contrary to what he wanted to do, when you lack that push from the tackles, the dynamic that comes by using KJ's legs is what will make his offense go. Because, I mean, this isn't a Brandon or Austin Allen back there, albeit they would give as much effort as KJ will. You saw what KJ did to that poor Kent State defensive back, Alex Branch, just 190 pounds, and he tried to come downhill and attempt to tackle KJ. He attempted to do something, but KJ just absorbed him pretty much. And, I mean, I think in that second time that he got bowled over, he didn't come back in the second half. Feel bad for the guy. I'm curious what the KJ usage plan will be against the BYU Cougars. You absolutely have to be better in the run game, and basically everything already discussed needs to be improved upon. They'll have to use KJ in this game, and I want to see him take some shots early, but we'll get to the BYU game, so we can just go ahead and move on. Now, going into the game, go ahead and look at the injury issues. Rocket officially is out for this game, and it sounds like Dwight McGlothern is going to be a game time decision, and that's huge because BYU's getting some guys back that we'll talk about in a second. BYU to this point, they're 2-0. They played Sam Houston State, the new FBS team, in week 1, beat them 14-0. Really bad game to watch if you were a BYU fan. Now, Sam Houston has a really gritty defense, but BYU still struggled to look impressive in every offensive category. They only totaled 257 yards, and then they ended up having Sam Houston's quarterback give them the ball back 3 times. Shoemaker threw 3 picks. Just needed a graphic label slapped on it. But do you remember the name Keaton Slovis by any chance, if you pay attention to recruiting? Well, he's landed at BYU, started his career at Southern Cal, went to Pitt last year, and everyone thought he might blow up there, and it didn't really happen. So now he's at BYU. He was responsible for both of those touchdowns that they got in week 1, both on the ground. He only threw for 145 yards. They had a freshman running back by the name of L.J. Martin, who made an impact in rushing out of nowhere, 91 yards on the ground. And then they played an even more inferior team in week 2, Southern Utah, who gave Arizona State a run for their money in week 1. BYU ended up beating them 41-16. They did struggle to run the ball, and I think it's a little bit of Southern Utah selling out, kind of like Western Carolina did to Arkansas in week 1. They ended up getting 46 yards on 23 carries. That's perfectly 2 per carry. Not ideal if you're BYU. Keaton Slovis did seem to settle in after a rough week 1. He went 22 of 32, almost 350 yards passing, 4 touchdowns. Now, their protection was also improved. Southern Utah tried to throw some stunts at him, do some twists inside, and the offensive line held strong. And then a guy had a coming out party that's been really solid for BYU for a while. Popped out as a redshirt freshman, then kind of went back behind the curtain. But Isaac Rex is a guy that I think has legit NFL potential at tight end. Picked up 4 catches, 112 yards, big red zone threat. Then you look at the other side of the ball. BYU's defense has 1 sack through 2 games. Now, they have proven that they can stop the run, but Southern Utah ended up exposing their less than ideal pass defense. I didn't mark down the quarterback's passing yards for Southern Utah, but I know it was 300 plus. So that's something worth noting. They weren't scared to throw the ball on them. Talking about those BYU injuries, they had their 2 best wideouts facing injury issues since fall camp. And now Cody Epps and Keanu Hill, they combined for 13 touchdowns last season. Epps is expected back in full form. I believe Hill should be back, but there's nothing guaranteed there. And so with that news, Arkansas is going to be in much better shape if Dwight McGlothern can play. So what do the Hogs need to do in this game? I mean, you could call this keys to victory. I don't want to call it keys to victory. I want to call it keys to handling business. Just getting in the door. They're going to need to put some pressure on Keaton Slovis to no end. We know that they're going to have the ability. And seeing that Southern Utah was trying to throw as many stunts at their offensive line and pass pro that they could, and it wasn't really doing anything, it does give me a little bit of doubt, but also I know Arkansas's defensive line is leagues better than whatever Southern Utah had to throw at them. Arkansas as a team currently has 9 sacks, so you keep bumping that number up. Second one is you don't let Isaac Rex become an easy bailout weapon because a lot of those 4 catches, I say a lot of 4, they were just little dump off passes to 5 yards up the field, those little 5-yard drags, or he would block and release and then no linebacker would cover him. And that's why I think those Jaheim Thomas coverage issues might be an issue coming into this game. They're going to have to really crack down on it because he's the linebacker with the size that can match up against him. So don't let him get going. You need to have success down the field early to keep their aggressive defensive style from loading the box. And in turn, you need to just establish something up front. You need to prove that you can hold your own because I don't think BYU is going to be scared of just rushing 4 or 5, at least early on, until Arkansas can prove that they're holding it, and then they might do more of an overload blitz. We'll see. They need to make sure they come out and prove that they've improved. That might need to copyright that. So coming into this game, looking at the line, Arkansas is a 10.5-point favorite, and it has dropped to 8 within the last hour. So that's news. Because with that 10.5 line, I said Arkansas should, without a shadow of a doubt, cover the spread unless they get off to a start like they had last week, needless to say. Now, our wide receivers outmeasured and out-physical their DBs by a pretty big margin. We just need KJ to be accurate on deep ball attempts. Now, their defense as a whole, mainly up front, doesn't scare me a lot. After adjustments will be made, it's just a matter of if it ends up showing up on the field. I had Arkansas covering that 10.5 line. I think going down to 8 makes it even easier to say they cover. Score prediction, I'll just throw one out there. Arkansas 34, BYU 17. If they get off to a scoreless first quarter, or you need Antonio Greer to come run down and get another pick 6 for you just to spark the game, they're going to be in trouble because BYU, they're not the same BYU team they used to be. Slovis is a quality quarterback, but they've lost a lot of really good players on this team, especially defensively. I mean, their over-under win total coming into the year was just 4.5, maybe 5.5 in some places. Take care of business. They're going to be physical. Kalani Sitake is no slouch when it comes down to being a head coach, and he's going to want revenge. So just do what you need to do because you have a big trip to Baton Rouge in prime time the week after. Now, what has happened to the SEC? I say as a transition here. Let me think on this. You all probably know what game I'm going to go to first, and it's Bama and Texas. Texas rolling out of Tuscaloosa with a 34-24 win. And that Alabama quarterback situation, is it actually as bad as expected? It seems like that box has been checked. And the reasoning behind that is no one else was given a shot because Milroe didn't have the greatest performance, 2 touchdowns to 2 picks. You have Tyler Buckner you brought in, he didn't get a shot. No Ty Simpson. So is there really that big of a drop-off behind what's already not being proven as good? It's a tough ask and probably a tough answer, and Saban would just not give it anyway. Yeah, Steve Sarkisian, he had Alabama's defense guessing on top of them not being able to match up with Xavier Worley and Adonai Mitchell down the field. Now, they could have put this game away earlier if they wanted to. Xavier Worthy has been known for having stone hands at times, and they showed up in the Alabama game. I believe he dropped 1 touchdown and another deep ball. It was just that 1 extra touchdown really could have blown the game open. And I mean, the score doesn't indicate how big of a gap this game really was. 10 points. It definitely could have been more like 24. We'll see. It brought the questions about Bama's O-line back to earth. Everyone thought that they showed flashes of being overly physical against Middle Tennessee. And, well, they struggled to get the run game going against Texas. USF might be in trouble because I feel like Alabama's going to want to prove that they can run the ball. And going over to the Texas side, I think Quinn Ewers may have put himself in the top 3 discussion for FBS quarterbacks after one game. Stats-wise, 349 pass yards, 3 touchdowns, no picks. And then he got the classic picture video after the game of him smoking a cig. So that's what you do after the big win. Now, as mentioned, Bama heads down to Tampa, play the USF Bulls in this coming week, and I would not want to be USF. Alabama is going to be heated. Now, we'll see what the players play like, but I know what Saban's going to be thinking, and he's going to want to prove a point. Then you shift down to what happened in Coral Gables. Jimbo, Bobby Petrino, they got beat by Miami 48-33. And it was another SEC offensive line kind of getting pushed around, only this time Miami ended up losing 2 of their interior defensive linemen, and A&M could still not establish a running game. And that ended up having Connor Wegman throw 51 pass attempts, which is a ton when you think of Jimbo, but obviously Petrino making the calls there. So A&M, now I had a lot of respect for Josh DeBerry and for the good transfer corners that they brought in, but I, as well as a lot of people, may have overhyped them because, I mean, DeBerry, he caught a lot of flack in this game. Had a lot of over-aggressive plays that bit him. I believe he was flagged a time or 2. Miami's Xavier Restrepo, he had 126 receiving yards. Jacoby George had 3 receiving touchdowns. It'll be good for Arkansas to catch A&M in shuffle mode in the secondary by week 5. Looking at the game, there's 1 touchdown where an A&M DB was just tripping for 10 yards trying to catch up to a Miami wideout on a vertical, and he fell down right as the ball got there. It just about sums up how the game ended up going for the Aggies. There was lots of faults on the coaching alone. You had that 4th and 1 inside the 10 that they lined up, and then Jimbo put his hands over his face because of a false start. And there was a handful of other procedural things. They also gave up a kick return for a touchdown, 98 yards in the second half. Now, the bright side for A&M is that Evan Stewart is an absolute dog. He proved he can be the guy in the slot or on the outside, and he went out there, caught 11 balls, I believe, for 148 yards, somewhere in that range. I might have overdone that by a margin. But he's going to be a guy that gets to 1,000 yards for them. If no one else is going to step up at receiver, it don't matter where you put him on the field. He fits in the slot. He fits on the outside because of his speed and route running. He's a problem. And then you also have Reuben Owens, the freshman running back. I feel like he's not going to be utilized as much as he could because he is overly physical. There's a handful of plays where he was running out of bounds and he would just give the shoulder or the stiff arm to a Miami DB and he would just stand still and they would be 10 feet under. Just a lot of potential on this team. And maybe Miami's just that good. Maybe they've making such a big leap, changing defensive coordinators. Tyler Van Dyke is back, looking like his 2021 self. A lot of things play into this. We'll just have to see what happens a month from now and check back and see who looks like what. And speaking of what, I don't know what the Auburn-Cal game was. You probably weren't awake for it. Started at 9 o'clock local time out there in Cal Berkeley. Auburn only won this game 14-10, and it was just all around ugly with a capital U because offense was just hard to come by. Peyton Thorne ended up throwing for just 94 yards. Cal's quarterback Sam Jackson the fifth threw 2 picks, and then you had Ben Finley check in, and he had just 34 pass yards on 7 completions. A running back that I like that's kind of popping onto the scene is Jaden Ott for Cal. He was a focal point heading into the game, and Auburn forced him to just 3.9 yards per carry, 20 rushes, 88 yards. There was no pass catcher that had over 40 yards for either team. Just barf, honestly. It wasn't even because the defense was necessarily impressive either. Not a lot of quarterback pressures, sacks, tackles for loss. It was just pitiful offense. And it led to that 14-10 game. I thought Cal, they scored early on in that game, caused issues. I believe Auburn turned it over on the first drive. Looked like it was going to be Cal's game to lose, and then it just, yeah, there's no need to go into that anymore. You can look back at week 1, LSU was throttled by Florida State. I said it. I liked Florida State on the first episode, or the last episode, I should say. I think Florida State's a playoff team. Now, LSU did look worse than what I thought they would be, but Florida State just put the foot on the throat. And LSU responded with a 72-10 win over Grambling. A little bit unnecessary, especially because that's an in-state team. Yeah, the other teams that struggled this past week, you look at Tennessee, they played dumb with Austin Peay in the first half. It was, I believe, after the first quarter, like 3-0 or 3-3, 6-6, something. It was not high scoring. I can promise you that. Yet Arizona take Mississippi State to overtime, despite Jaden DeLora throwing 4 interceptions. He still passed for over 300 yards and got 2 touchdowns. Prove that their pass defense is vulnerable as long as he's not putting the ball in danger, which I feel like he was just the kind of quarterback to just chuck it up there. He likes to run around, do some Johnny Manziel things, and just throw the ball for the heck of it. You had Kentucky and Missouri. They had a little bit of a buffering symbol in their games as they played Eastern Kentucky and Middle Tennessee State, respectively. It's not looking good for the SEC, and I don't want to get into the conversation of like, oh, what conference is now the best? I would lean Big Ten, but we'll see. Now, the game that I had to attend because of, I guess, the chains that are figuratively around my wrist is Arkansas State hosted Memphis for a game that you can typically throw the records out the window for. The past 2 seasons, the game has come down to the last drive or 2. And last year, they should have actually won it, but gave up 2 touchdowns in the last 2 minutes. They got the doors blown off 37-3 this time around and have been outscored in the 2023 season 100-3. Best player on this team, Dominique Zavada, had a 34-yard field goal there in the first half. And allow me to elaborate slightly. Under Butch Jones, there has been a struggle to find aggression in a fight in this team, and it has reduced itself to 0 in this season. It seems like the players don't want to play for him. And that's just from an outside perspective looking in. I don't know how the culture is holding up. And matter of fact, I don't know what kind of culture he's really trying to establish. It's symbols on a wall. It's like you go into a pyramid and you're trying to read hieroglyphs. It's I don't know. Now the quarterback bias, I say bias, it's a suspicion. If you remember JT Shrout, he landed at Arkansas State over the summer. JT Shrout played under Butch Jones and was recruited by Butch Jones while at Tennessee, and then ended up going to Colorado and left after Dion got there. That's the full story. Now he's here. He has been bad, and I mean like very bad. Against Memphis, he was throwing a lot of one-on-one balls up to guys that had zero shot. And not only that, but he wasn't even putting it out on the sideline. He wasn't trying to go over the shoulder catches. It was guys that were locked in battles. And I believe he threw 3 interceptions in the first half. And not to mention, I don't even think it's just his fault, but you have a lack of talent at the skill positions. Corey Rucker's not been himself after leaving Arkansas State, going to South Carolina last year, and coming back. I don't know what it is. The running back position's just a massive question mark. Now, they did put in Jaquez Cross, Fordyce native. Got to watch him play in high school. He looked really good. He's also on special teams as a return man. I think he deserves more carries. And they play Stony Brook this coming Saturday. And I'd like to see Allen Daly, the freshman quarterback, get more of a chance. He came in, looked very solid in the second half. Not that there was anything to play for at that point, so credit to him for going out there and I guess making a name for himself. We'll see if the JT Shrout injury is enough to keep him sidelined and give Daly the reins for week 3. But you have the narrative under Butch that he's had 2 years in a row of recruiting the top Sunbelt class. Get it out of my face. If that's what drove him to get an extension after a 2-win season, there's no wonder the local radio is full of a lot of angry people. So, is it going to come down to a midseason firing if they struggle or even lose to Stony Brook? Now, Stony Brook is pretty bad. They're one of the worst FCS teams. They won 2 games last year, and the year before, probably not much more. And they started this season 0-2. Granted, they've played 2 of the top FCS teams. We'll see what happens. We'll see what happens. Give the young talent a chance. And speaking of not good, I mentioned that week 3 college football slate. There's some games in here that I think can be sneaky good. And we'll start. I'm going to look at a good handful of games, talk about the lines on them. We'll start on Friday night at 7 p.m. on CBS Sports. We have the Mountain West Conference opener. Utah State's going to go play at Air Force. Air Force favored by 9.5 as it stands. Utah State, they have Blake Anderson, so we obviously have a tie to that game here at State. You have Cooper Legis. He seems like he's been getting better under Anderson. Last year looked kind of so-so. Now he has the story of his first ever pass attempt in college in the bowl game against Oregon State being a 75-yard bomb, which is fun. But I think last year he had like a 10 or 11 touchdown to 6 interception ratio. He's had a really good season so far, but against inferior teams. Air Force themselves, they look like the typical teams of the past. They have a really gritty defense. They win the time of possession on offense. And because of that, now the Sam Houston game, they played Sam Houston last week. They only won 13-3. I think it was kind of a respect thing. I said Sam Houston has a really respectable defense, and they forced Air Force to have to run it because in week 1 they threw the ball for 95 yards, oddly enough. Now with Air Force favored by 9.5, I like it. I would say Air Force wins and covers. Really with no issue. Utah State has just not proven enough to me over the past year. Now, if Blake Anderson get this team to go in there and win a Friday night primetime game, I'll start looking. Move to Saturday. Penn State at Illinois. It's an 11 a.m. kickoff. Penn State favored by 15, and I'd like to see if that line might drop, but I doubt it does. This might have been the game of the week had Illinois shown up against Kansas last week. But you had this guy by the name of Jalen Daniels who had a field day against Brett Bielema's defense on that Friday night game. Now, I feel like a lot of that comes from the threat of him being able to run the ball because he is a deadly dual threat quarterback. And then you look at what Penn State's going to be bringing in. They have Drew Aller. He's been as advertised at the quarterback position, and they're going to force him to make plays as a guy that's not a runner. Now, James Franklin, Penn State's head coach, has said he's a lot better of a runner than what he thought coming in. But so far, they haven't had to use the legs. We'll see. I think he's going to be good enough to just dot up Illinois. Almost got beat by Toledo in week 1, and then Kansas kind of caused them to implode. I like Penn State in this game. It might be a slow start. Illinois' defense is going to show up, but I think Penn State can start leaning on them and getting some guys open downfield. You have another 11 a.m. kick. LSU at Mississippi State. LSU favored by 9. It was 9.5 whenever this morning rolled around. Now, after seeing what Jaden DeLora did to Mississippi State, I'm not scared to say Jaden Daniels will have a chance to maybe mature a little bit against a beatable SEC defense. You look at the other quarterback, Will Rogers. He only threw 17 balls in their last game. So they have faith in Jaquavion. It feels like it's been both in his career. Anyway, the Bulldogs running back. Do they have faith in that run game? It seems like they do. And their offensive coordinator, Barbe, whenever he was at App State, had a loaded running back room, and he ran the legs off of those guys. So if he has faith in a couple running backs, I'm not going to be shocked if they try to establish the run again. But if they can't, no one's saying that Will Rogers can't throw the football because, I mean, he's broken SEC records, and he's been around for, this is his 4th year as a starter? It just really feels like this is one of those games that LSU is going to need to make a comeback in. And because of that, I like Mississippi State to cover, but I still like LSU to win this game. And set up, if Arkansas can win a top 25 matchup in Baton Rouge, may have to go attend that one because you don't get Death Valley at night very often. Kansas State at Missouri, another 11 a.m. kick. Kansas State is just a 5-point favorite after what they did to a good Troy team last week. I think they beat them 42-13. Will Howard, Kansas State's quarterback, he's going to run circles around Brady Cook in this game. Brady Cook, Missouri's quarterback, he's had a very solid season for what it's worth. But I think there's going to be plenty of Kansas State fans in the crowd in Columbia to balance out maybe some home field advantage. You have Missouri's running back, Cody Schrader. He's a really tough runner, but he'll be running into a defense that's allowing 38.5 yards per game on the ground. The one job for Kansas State in this game is going to be limit, not stop, Luther Burden, because you're not going to be able to stop him. He's just too freaking talented. And if they do limit him, it's going to be unbelievably easy money on K-State to cover this game. I feel like -5. Not that I think Kansas State is just that incredible. It's just Missouri has not proven anything to me. Beating Middle Tennessee State by 4, having to pull away from South Dakota in week 1 late. Give me Kansas State. Now, I think a sleeper game is Georgia Southern traveling up to Camp Randall Stadium in Wisconsin for another 11 a.m. game. Wisconsin's favored by 19. And I want to mention Georgia Southern. If you forgot where Clay Helton went after he was fired from USC or released, let go, went on vacation, whatever, don't sleep on his team at Georgia Southern. He brought in Davis Brin from Tulsa, and he's been an excellent replacement for Kyle Van Treese, their quarterback a year ago. Georgia Southern will absolutely need to limit the run game as much as possible. Ches Malusi, Braylon Allen, one of the best running back duos in college football. They did a great job last week against UAB, slowing the run, but in turn gave up over 300 yards passing. It's a pick your poison type of thing. Make Mordecai throw the ball. He's proven thus far that he will throw it into coverage if you make him. In Wisconsin, they're coming off a loss at Washington State. They're going to be in bounce back mode, wounded animal mode, as Josh Pate puts it. But they can't let this game get into a back and forth firework battle because Georgia Southern will hang around if Davis Brin takes care of the football. Wisconsin -19. I like Georgia Southern to cover. I don't want to pick them to win. I think it'll be about a 2-score game, and I feel like that line is just a little too high. A sleeper game here out on the West Coast, San Diego State at Oregon State, 2:30. Oregon State comes in favored by 24.5. Now, they've had an impressive start to the season, but it hasn't really felt that way. DJ Uiagalelei has been really solid, but his quiet start has kept eyes on the bigger Pac-12 players, looking at Oregon, USC, UCLA, Washington, Colorado. I think a lot of Oregon State not being talked about is because of what Deion Sanders has done. And I don't think Jonathan Smith, the head coach at Oregon State, could be happier that that's happening because he has a heck of a squad and a really good defense. Speaking of that defense, under 250 yards allowed per game, while San Diego State is allowing almost 450 yards per game defensively. San Diego State's quarterback, Jalen Maiden, he can keep San Diego State in this game if he plays smart, and he's not really known to do it. He's a really big risk taker, but he does bring the quarterback run to the table that no quarterback Oregon State has faced this far has. He's a big, stocky 6'3" quarterback. He'll run over some DBs. He's got a little KJ Jefferson in him in that regard. And for Oregon State, I think it's a classic sandwich game, coming off a big win against a ranked Wisconsin, or I'm thinking of Washington State again. That's who they play next week. They go to Washington State, who's coming off of a big win, and they're now ranked after beating Wisconsin. So maybe they sleep a little bit on San Diego State, who's not the same Mountain West team they have been the past 2 years under Brady Hoke. I like San Diego State to cover that 24.5, but I don't think they're going to win. Matter of fact, it might not even be that close. It might end up being like a 31-10 type of game. And honestly, that is what I would lean towards. But even then, San Diego State covers. One of the best games, I believe, assuming everything goes well, is Minnesota at North Carolina. It's a 2:30 kick. North Carolina favored by 7.5. Minnesota's quarterback, he has a fun name, Ethan Kaliak-Manis. Now, he's not been the second coming of Tanner Morgan at quarterback, and so the defense has bailed out that piss-poor offense that the Beavers have, or the Golden Gophers. Goodness. Minnesota, the quarterbacks they've faced have been insurmountable, I say sarcastically. Jeff Sims, who proved he could not throw the football against Colorado either, and Austin Smith of Eastern Michigan. Now they get this guy by the name of Drake May, who's, I've heard he's pretty good. They're going to absolutely force him to make plays through the air. And unfortunately for them, he did make a couple just really lucky throws against South Carolina. They're not going to like that, especially if their offense can't get going. This is not going to be a high-scoring game unless Drake May starts dotting them up early. Then it might get ugly. But UNC favored by 7.5. I don't think Minnesota's offense is good enough. If North Carolina's defense, especially their defensive line, can do what they did to South Carolina, they're going to cover, no problem. Washington at Michigan State amidst everything. 4 o'clock kickoff. Washington's favored by 16. How is this Spartan team going to respond amidst everything at hand? If you haven't heard, I'll touch it briefly. Their head coach, Mel Tucker, has been given accusations and has been released from the team without pay, not fired yet. He's trying to fight back against it. A lot of things going on. Former head coach Mark D'Antonio is going to be helping out somewhere. They haven't really said where, so I thought that's an interesting thing. But the best thing for them going into this game is that their quarterback, Noah Kim, is pretty competent. The downside is that they're playing one of the best quarterbacks in all of college football, in Michael Penix. He has nearly 900 yards in just 2 games. He's looked otherworldly. We'll give him that. Michigan State's hardest test to this point was against Central Michigan, and they didn't even know whether their quarterback was a running back or a quarterback. Led the team in passing and rushing, had like 80-something yards passing. It was just weird. Now, this game has the vibes that it could be either really close or you're going to see Michigan State's blood splattered everywhere over their stadium, and you're going to see fans leaving out of that game by halftime. Washington favored by 16. I like to lean towards the splattering in this case. I think Washington covers. Now, sleeper game, Georgia Tech at Ole Miss at 6:30, SEC Network, I believe. Ole Miss favored by 19, but we talked about a sandwich game. Ole Miss goes to Bama next week. And if you remember this guy that played for A&M by the name of Haynes King, he's alive and well in Atlanta. And this point in the season for Georgia Tech has 603 pass yards, 7 touchdowns, and 1 pick. And after you saw what he did under Jimbo, you're looking at him like, are you sure this is the same guy? I mean, what could be different about him? Just a change of scenery, apparently. He also has 2 really good deep threats in Chase Lane, who came over with him from A&M, and Eric Singleton Jr. Those are their 2 leading receivers and average 17 yards per catch and 20 yards per catch, respectively. Ole Miss against Tulane had their secondary exposed slightly. They got beat by the deep ball a few times, so that's why I mentioned those 2 guys. The biggest problem for Georgia Tech is they have 0 sacks through 2 games. Their defensive line's pretty bad. They lost the defensive lineman to the NFL draft last year, and they're gonna need to get Dart off in this game if they want a chance early, because he's just gonna have to throw it to Trey Harris. Zachary Franklin's still kinda doubtful at this point because of his injuries back in fall camp. Trey Harris is their leading receiver, leading touchdown guy. He's been nothing short of impressive, and that's about what I expected from him coming over from Louisiana Tech. I like Georgia Tech to cover in this case. Or Ole Miss favored by 19. Like I said, they play Bama next week. Georgia Tech is not a bad team. They almost beat Louisville, and matter of fact, they probably should have in week 1 in Mercedes-Benz Stadium. So give me Georgia Tech. TCU at Houston. It's a 7 o'clock kick. It's the Big 12 opener for the Houston Cougars. TCU comes in favored by 7.5. And for those who didn't catch Houston last week, they played Rice and they lost to Food. 43-41 was the final score. They were down 28-0 at this game in the first half. They scored 1 touchdown before halftime and scored 28 unanswered that brought them to overtime. Donovan Smith, their quarterback, and Samuel Brown at receiver was a connection that got them back into this game, and they seem to be on target with each other. That'll be something to watch, see if TCU can kind of disrupt that. And the Horned Frogs, they're going to get their points, but Houston has been great at keeping the ball safe, which means there's a really high chance that this game becomes a shootout, which leads me to that over-under, which is 64.5. I figured it would be higher. That's a number that's hard not to bite on if you're into betting on overs. But the week 1 game for Houston was a 17-14 win against UTSA, and that sits there with a UTSA defense that's kind of so-so. They brought back a handful of good guys. So it's just a really tough number to look at. I like Houston to cover against TCU. I think that's going to be a pretty darn good game that not a lot of people are paying attention to, outside the fact that it's Houston's first official Big 12 game. And then the game of the week for me, you look at College Game Day, they're going down to see Dion play the Colorado State Rocky Mountain Showdown nightmare for the Rams. I mean, I can't put it any other way. It's not going to be a pretty game. Colorado's not going to sleepwalk. I feel like their players have too much swagger to just go in there and not show up in a game that they want to win and keep a trophy for. My game of the week, Pitt goes to West Virginia. It's a 6:30 kick, ABC. That is a rivalry game that means a lot to both of these teams, despite how little they play it. Pittsburgh comes in as a 1-point favorite. I would not be shocked to see that fall to even or even maybe lean West Virginia by the time kickoff happens. You got a quarterback matchup of Phil Dracovic versus Garrett Green, and there's been no interceptions for those two thus far in the season. Now, West Virginia, they bring more of a balanced attack, but then you saw what Drew Aller did. They proved that their defense can get picked apart to eliminate how balanced their offensive attack is. And then you look at Phil Dracovic for Pitt. He had so much hype, and what seemed like, at least a decade ago, whenever he started playing at Notre Dame, went to Boston College, he may have figured everything out at Pitt. Now, I would not want to play on this game, but I'll be all over it. I'm going to have it up on my phone while I'm attending the A-State Stony Brook game on Saturday. Not afraid to say that. It was how it was with the Texas-Alabama game this past Saturday. This game might get wild in a good way. And like I said, College Game Day picking Colorado, going into smother Colorado State, which is typical of ESPN, I might add. While this game sits on the table, a crucial rivalry, despite the teams being 1-1, just not ideal. I like if Pitt stays as a 1-point favorite, I like West Virginia to cover. So before I get into a recap here, make sure my voice doesn't slip. Let's recap the picks. Starting from the top, Air Force minus 9.5, Penn State minus 15, Mississippi State plus 9, Kansas State minus 5, Georgia Southern plus 19, San Diego State plus 24.5, North Carolina minus 7.5, Washington minus 16, Georgia Tech plus 19, Houston plus 7.5, and West Virginia plus 1. And I'll throw one more fun one in there. I mentioned Bama goes down to play in Tampa. Bama's favored by 32. I think that game is going to get ugly. I think they might cover that 32 at half. UCF lost a lot of players. I don't really know who their quarterback is, who their running back is. They lost Brian Beatty to Auburn, who's their little tiny jelly bean running back. I don't know. But I can promise you, Bama's not going to go in there very happy. But I believe that wraps it up. Like I said, if you were so willing to accept my message of bets, then by all means, just don't come at me because it's not my fault. I told you ahead of time, you don't have to listen to me. But just so you don't have to listen to me much longer, Hawgin the Mic can be heard on Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, Google Podcasts, and if you're listening over on YouTube, please like and subscribe and share the podcast with anyone you're willing. If you want to follow me personally over on Instagram, it's Brady_Michael, Michael, replace the I with a 1. Over on X at @BMichael with Michael the same way. And if you're into the article side of sports media, go check out my articles over on fifthquarter.net/author/I'm Just Brady. If you stuck around with me this long, thank you. And I guess that's it. Keep getting into this week. We got a lot of football coming on this weekend. It's just a matter of how good these games might actually be. But again, thank you for listening. I'm Brady Michael, and I'm no longer hogging the mic. I will catch all of you next time.